When a father walked into the school bathroom and found his daughter sobbing, he was ready to do anything to protect her. What did she tell him that led to the 911 call? Don't miss this emotional story. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with new videos and click the bell so you don't miss the next stories. Write in the comments, what would you do if you were this father? The morning sun bathed the Dorson household in soft golden light, filtering through the sheer curtains of the kitchen window as the family gathered for breakfast. 9-year-old Alyssa Dorson, a bright, eager student, sat at the table, her feet swinging back and forth under the chair as she munched on a piece of toast. Her parents, Mary and Daniel, moved about the kitchen, chatting about their day ahead. The warmth of the family dynamic was palpable, the kind of loving, supportive environment every child dreamed of. Alyssa had always been an enthusiastic learner. Ever since she could read, she had devoured every book her parents gave her. She loved school. It wasn't just a place to learn, it was a place to grow, to make friends, to explore. Her parents, proud of their daughter's determination, nurtured her curiosity. Mary, an English teacher at a neighboring school, often helped Alyssa with her writing, while Daniel, an engineer, enjoyed solving math puzzles with her. Alyssa was particularly fond of math, the puzzles, the logic, the thrill of solving a difficult problem. She loved the sense of accomplishment that came with finding the right answer. Ready for another day of conquering the world? Daniel asked with a smile, sitting down at the table with his coffee. Alyssa grinned. Almost. I've got my math quiz today, and I've been practicing so much. I think I'm ready. Of course you are, Mary chimed in, her hand resting gently on Alyssa's shoulder as she passed. You've always been one of the top students in your class. You've got this. Alyssa beamed. She felt invincible with her parents' encouragement. Somerton Elementary had been a great experience for her so far. Though she was one of the few black students in her class, it had never seemed to matter before. Her teachers had always treated her fairly, and she had plenty of friends. The new school year had just begun, and Alyssa felt confident this year would be no different. That morning, as she walked into the school, her backpack bouncing on her small shoulders, she noticed a new face in the classroom. Mr. Grayson, the new teacher, stood tall and stern at the front of the room, looking over the students as they filed in. He was older, with a sharp jawline and graying hair that added to his authoritative presence. His dark eyes seemed to scan every movement, and Alyssa felt a slight chill as his gaze briefly settled on her before moving on. Good morning, class, Mr. Grayson began, his voice deep and commanding. I'm your new teacher, and I expect nothing but your best effort. His tone was serious, and while some of the kids seemed a bit taken aback, Alyssa didn't think much of it. After all, some teachers were stricter than others. She settled into her seat, ready to face her first lesson with him. The first week passed relatively uneventfully. Mr. Grayson ran a tight ship in the classroom and his lessons were structured and efficient. But by the second week, Alyssa began to notice something off. Whenever she raised her hand, eager to answer a question, Mr. Grayson either ignored her or gave her a dismissive look. At first, she thought she was imagining things. Maybe he just didn't see her hand. But it started happening more often. She would watch as he called on other students, even those who weren't as prepared as she was. When he did call on her, it was usually to point out a mistake or to correct her in a way that felt unnecessarily harsh. One particular day, they were working on math problems at the board. Alyssa had always been confident in math, but when Mr. Grayson called her up, she felt a knot form in her stomach. She took the chalk and began to solve the problem he assigned. Halfway through, she hesitated, unsure if she was going in the right direction. She glanced back at Mr. Grayson, hoping for a nod or some small encouragement, but instead, his cold eyes bore into her. "Come on, Alyssa," he said, his voice sharp. "Surely you can do something this simple." Her hand trembled slightly as she continued writing, and the numbers on the board started to blur. She finished the equation, though she wasn't entirely sure it was correct. When she stepped back, Mr. Grayson walked up to the board, his steps slow and deliberate. "Well," he said, his tone dripping with disdain, "this isn't exactly wrong, but it's not right either. Maybe you should spend a little more time studying, Alyssa." The class tittered, and Alyssa felt her cheeks burn with shame. She hurried back to her seat, her head down, trying to ignore the quiet giggles from some of the other kids. It was the first time she had felt truly singled out, and she didn't understand why. She had always been a good student, always tried her hardest. Why did Mr. Grayson seem to have a problem with her? That evening, back at home, Alyssa tried to shake off the day's events. At dinner, her parents noticed her quiet demeanor. "How was school today?" Mary asked gently, sensing something was off. Alyssa forced a smile. It was fine, just a normal day. She didn't want to worry them. They had always been so proud of her accomplishments. She didn't want them to think she couldn't handle things on her own. Besides, she wasn't even sure if what she felt was real. Maybe she was just being too sensitive. But as the days passed, things only got worse. Mr. Grayson began calling on her less and less, and when he did, it was always with a tone of condescension. He made small, offhand comments that seemed designed to cut her down. When she answered a question in class, he would say things like, "Well, that's close, but maybe someone else can explain it better." The other students started picking up on his behavior. Some of them began to laugh when he corrected her, and Alyssa could feel the isolation setting in. She began to dread going to school. The place that had once been a haven of learning and discovery was now a source of anxiety. Every time she entered the classroom, she felt the weight of Mr. Grayson's eyes on her, waiting for her to slip up. She stopped volunteering to answer questions, afraid of being humiliated again. She didn't want to stand out anymore. One morning, the final blow came. The class was working on a group project, and Mr. Grayson had assigned the groups himself. Alyssa was the last one called, and instead of placing her with one of the more active groups, he sent her to work alone at the back of the room. "Alyssa," he said, his voice carrying across the classroom, "I think you'd be better off working by yourself. We wouldn't want to slow down the rest of the class." The words stung. She glanced around the room, seeing the smug looks on some of her classmates' faces, and her heart sank. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never come back. That night, as Alyssa lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't hold back the tears any longer. She had always loved school, always felt confident in her abilities, but now every day felt like a battle, one she wasn't sure she could win. And the worst part was, she didn't know why. Why was Mr. Grayson treating her this way? Why was she the only one he seemed to target? But even with all these questions swirling in her mind, Alyssa still couldn't bring herself to tell her parents. She was afraid they would make a big deal out of it, afraid they would confront Mr. Grayson and make things worse. No, she thought, she could handle this on her own. She just had to try harder, be better. Maybe then he would stop. As the days wore on, though, Alyssa's confidence continued to erode. She withdrew into herself, her once bright and lively personality dimming under the weight of Mr. Grayson's constant criticism. Her friends noticed the change, but no one said anything. No one wanted to cross Mr. Grayson. At home, her parents were growing concerned. Mary had noticed that Alyssa no longer talked about school with the same excitement as before. Daniel had seen her spending more time in her room, her laughter less frequent. They both tried to ask her about it, but Alyssa brushed them off, insisting everything was fine. But it wasn't fine, far from it. The stage was set, and the tension was building. Alyssa's silence grew heavier with each passing day, her once unbreakable spirit slowly eroding under the weight of Mr. Grayson's constant undermining. The time was approaching when the pressure would become too much, when Alyssa's inner turmoil would no longer allow her to stay silent. But how much longer could she hold on? The storm that was brewing within her would soon reach a breaking point, and what would happen then, no one could predict. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Alyssa woke each morning with a sinking feeling in her stomach, dreading the thought of going back to school. The place that had once filled her with excitement and joy now felt more like a prison. Mr. Grayson's behavior had shifted from subtle jabs and quiet dismissals to open aggression, and it was impossible to ignore. The invisible wall between Alyssa and her classmates was growing taller with each passing day, and the once vibrant connection she had with her school was dissolving into fear and isolation. Mr. Grayson no longer hesitated to single her out. He called on Alyssa only when he was sure she would make a mistake, and when she did, his corrections were sharp and cutting. The way he spoke to her in front of the class with a voice filled with disdain made it clear to everyone that he had little respect for her. Sometimes it seemed like he took pleasure in her discomfort, like every mistake she made was a small victory for him. "Come on, Alyssa," he sneered one morning as she fumbled with a math problem at the board. "You should know this by now. What's the matter? Not paying attention again?" Alyssa's heart raced. Her palms were sweaty as she tried to think, her mind going blank under the pressure of his gaze and the quiet snickers of her classmates behind her. The numbers on the board blurred before her eyes, and all she wanted was to disappear. She scribbled an answer, hoping it would be right, but when she turned back to him, she saw the familiar cold smirk forming on his face. "Wrong again," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You need to focus, Alyssa. Or maybe this is just too much for you. Perhaps you belong in the lower-level group." Her classmates laughed. It wasn't the kind of loud, obnoxious laughter that rang out during a joke. It was quiet, mean-spirited, the type that made Alyssa feel small and exposed. She hurried back to her seat, keeping her eyes down, her throat tight with shame. She didn't dare look at anyone as she sank into her chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. But it wasn't just the public humiliations. There was something even more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Mr. Grayson had a way of using his power as a teacher to isolate Alyssa from her peers. During group assignments, he deliberately left her out. When the students were instructed to pair up or work together, he made sure Alyssa was left to work alone. The first time it happened, she convinced herself it was just an oversight. Maybe it was random. Maybe he didn't mean to do it, but when it happened again and again, she knew it wasn't by accident. One day, as the class prepared for a science project, Mr. Grayson assigned everyone into groups, carefully pairing off the students. Alyssa was the last one standing, and she felt her heart pound in her chest as the other students looked at her, waiting to see who she would work with. Mr. Grayson didn't even bother to look up from his desk as he spoke. "Alyssa," he said, "you can work on this by yourself. I'm sure you'll do just fine on your own." Alyssa's stomach dropped. She stood frozen, staring at the floor, trying to hide the tears that were welling up in her eyes. She felt everyone's eyes on her, felt the judgment in their stares. As she moved to the back of the classroom, her hands trembling, she overheard a few whispered comments from her classmates. They weren't loud, but they were loud enough. "Of course she's by herself," one boy muttered. "Who'd want to work with her?" "She's so weird," a girl whispered back, "always messing things up." Alyssa wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them how unfair it all was, how none of this was her fault. But instead, she sat down at her desk, biting her lip and fighting back the tears. She couldn't let them see her cry. Not again. As the weeks dragged on, it became clear that Mr. Grayson's behavior wasn't going unnoticed by her classmates. In fact, many of them seemed to follow his lead. The quiet snickers and mocking whispers that had started early in the semester were becoming more frequent, more aggressive. Kids who had once been friendly with Alyssa now avoided her, not wanting to be associated with the girl the teacher had chosen as his target. Others were emboldened by Mr. Grayson's obvious disdain for her, and they began to openly mock her during class. It started small, little things like eye rolls or giggles when she raised her hand. But soon it escalated. During lunch breaks, Alyssa found herself sitting alone more often than not. When she tried to join in conversations, she was met with cold stares or cruel jokes. Even the friends she thought she could count on began to drift away, too afraid or indifferent to stand up for her. One particularly cold afternoon, Alyssa was standing in line for lunch when she overheard a conversation behind her. Two girls were whispering, their eyes darting toward her every few seconds. "She's so weird," one of them said. "She never talks anymore. Probably thinks she's better than us." The other girl snorted. "Yeah, right. Mr. Grayson is right about her. She can't even do basic math without screwing up." Alyssa's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The words stung, but what hurt even more was the fact that they came from people she used to consider friends. She had never been weird. She had never been the outcast, but now, thanks to Mr. Grayson, that was exactly how everyone saw her. Her home, once a sanctuary from the world, became a place where she felt more and more like she was living a double life. Every night, her parents asked how her day went, and every night, Alyssa forced a smile and told them it was fine. She couldn't bear to tell them the truth. What if they confronted Mr. Grayson? What if they made things worse? She could already imagine his smug face, twisting her words and making her feel like she was the problem. But the pressure was mounting, and Alyssa felt like she was slowly suffocating. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon during another math lesson. Mr. Grayson was at the front of the class explaining a new concept that Alyssa had already learned at home with her father. She knew the material well, but she had no intention of raising her hand. She couldn't bear the thought of being singled out again. But Mr. Grayson wasn't about to let her go unnoticed. "Alyssa," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet classroom, "why don't you come up and show the class how to solve this problem?" Her heart sank. She hadn't raised her hand, hadn't volunteered, but there he was, calling her out again. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling as she walked to the front of the room. The chalk felt heavy in her hand as she stared at the problem on the board, her mind racing. She knew the answer. She was sure of it. But as she began to write, the familiar feeling of doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if he laughed at her again? Her hand shook as she finished writing the solution, and she turned to face Mr. Grayson, hoping, praying, that this time she had gotten it right. But his expression didn't change. He walked over to the board, examining her work with a smirk that made her stomach turn. "Well," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole class to hear, "that's one way to do it, I suppose. Not the correct way, but I guess it's the best you can do." The class erupted in laughter. Alyssa's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of everyone. She bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, and she rushed back to her seat, her face burning with humiliation. As she sat down, Mr. Grayson added one final comment, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe we should start assigning you some simpler work, Alyssa. It seems like you're struggling with the basics." That was it. That was the moment Alyssa felt something inside her break. The laughter, the whispers, the constant humiliation. It was too much. She couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, she bolted from her seat, tears streaming down her face, and ran out of the classroom. She didn't stop until she reached the bathroom, where she locked herself in a stall and finally let the sobs rack her body. The sound of her own crying echoed off the cold, tiled walls, and for the first time, she felt completely and utterly alone. Her world was falling apart, and she didn't know how to fix it. Alyssa's heart pounded as she sat huddled on the cold bathroom floor, the weight of everything crashing down on her at once. She had kept silent for too long, hoping the situation would get better, but it hadn't. It had only gotten worse. And now, as the tears streamed down her face, she knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. Something had to change. The question was, how? Could she really tell her parents the full truth? Could she trust them to understand, to help without making things worse? Her thoughts swirled in a sea of confusion and fear, but deep down, Alyssa knew what had to happen next. The silence had to end. The echo of her own sobs still rang in Alyssa's ears as she sat huddled in the bathroom stall, her body shaken with each breath. She had never felt so alone, so humiliated. Mr. Grayson's voice, the cruel laughter of her classmates, the constant isolation, it all weighed on her small shoulders, and she couldn't carry it anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. For weeks she had hidden the pain, forced a smile in front of her parents, and told them nothing was wrong. But now, after running out of class in tears, she knew that pretending was no longer an option. After what felt like hours, Alyssa finally stood up, wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater, and splashed cold water on her face. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired and drained, far from the bright, eager student who had started the school year. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. There was no escaping the truth anymore. Tonight, she would have to tell her parents everything. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Alyssa avoided eye contact with everyone, kept her head down, and barely spoke a word. When the final bell rang, she rushed out of the school, not bothering to wait for anyone or stop by her locker. She wanted to go home, to hide away from the world. But deep down, she knew hiding wasn't going to fix anything. The problem wasn't going away on its own. As she stepped through the front door of her house, the familiar smell of her mother's cooking greeted her. But instead of comforting her, it made her stomach twist with anxiety. She had been dreading this moment all day. How could she explain everything that had been happening without breaking down? How could she make her parents understand the nightmare she had been living through for weeks? Alyssa lingered in the hallway, unsure of how to start. She could hear her parents talking in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes as they prepared dinner. They sounded so normal, so at peace. She hated the thought of shattering that peace with her story, but she couldn't hold it in any longer. "Alyssa, is that you?" her mother called from the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready. How was school today?" Alyssa swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. It was fine," she replied automatically, her voice barely audible. But it wasn't fine. And deep down, she knew her parents could sense that something was wrong. For weeks, they had been asking her if everything was okay, and for weeks she had brushed them off with half-hearted excuses. But today, there was no hiding it. The moment she stepped into the kitchen, her mother's eyes met hers, and the concerned frown on her face deepened. "Alyssa," Mary said gently, setting down the spoon she had been stirring with, "what's wrong? You've been so quiet lately, and today, you seem really upset. Did something happen at school?" Alyssa bit her lip, the tears already starting to well up in her eyes again. She couldn't hold back anymore. She had to tell them. Her father, who had been setting the table, stopped and turned to look at her, his brow furrowed with worry. "Sweetheart, you can tell us," Daniel said softly, his voice filled with concern. "Whatever it is, we're here for you." The dam broke. Alyssa's legs wobbled, and she sank into a chair at the table, covering her face with her hands as the tears spilled over. "It's Mr. Grayson," she sobbed. He hates me. He's been so mean to me for weeks, and I don't know why. He always picks on me in class, and he makes fun of me in front of everyone. He says things, horrible things, and everyone laughs at me. I can't take it anymore." Her parents stood frozen for a moment, shock etched on their faces. Alyssa had always been so strong, so independent. They had no idea she had been dealing with something like this for so long, and the realization hit them like a ton of bricks. Mary rushed over to her daughter, kneeling beside her and wrapping her arms around her. "Oh, Alyssa," Mary whispered, her voice shaken with emotion. "Why didn't you tell us sooner? We could have helped you." "I was scared," Alyssa choked out between sobs. "I didn't want to make things worse. I didn't want him to be even meaner to me. I thought maybe it was my fault." "Your fault?" Daniel's voice rose slightly, his anger starting to build. "Alyssa, this is not your fault. Not even close. What he's doing is wrong. It's not okay for a teacher to treat a student like that. You should never have had to go through this alone." Alyssa sniffled, looking up at her father through tear-filled eyes. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to make sure this stops," Daniel said, his jaw tight with determination. "No one should be allowed to treat you like this, especially not a teacher. We're going to the school tomorrow, and we're going to talk to the principal. Mr. Grayson is going to answer for what he's done." Alyssa's heart raced at the thought of confronting Mr. Grayson, but she knew her father was right. This had gone on long enough. It was time for her parents to step in. She couldn't fight this battle alone anymore. That night, after dinner, Alyssa lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind swirling with anxiety. She had told her parents the truth, and they were going to do something about it. But what if Mr. Grayson denied everything? What if the school didn't believe her? The fear of what might happen next weighed heavily on her, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely alone. Her parents were on her side now. Together, they would figure this out. The next morning, Daniel and Mary drove Alyssa to school, their faces set with determination. As they pulled into the parking lot, Alyssa's stomach churned with nerves. She had no idea how this confrontation would go, but she knew it had to happen. The walk to the principal's office felt like it took hours, even though it was only a few minutes. Alyssa kept her head down, avoiding the stares of her classmates as they made their way through the hallway. When they reached the office, the receptionist glanced up with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Dorson. How can I help you today?" "We'd like to speak with the principal," Daniel said firmly, his hand resting protectively on Alyssa's shoulder. "It's urgent." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded and picked up the phone. "Of course. Please have a seat, and I'll let her know you're here." Alyssa sat between her parents in the waiting area, her hands clenched in her lap. Her heart raced as they waited, the minutes ticking by in agonizing silence. Finally, the door to the principal's office opened, and Principal Harris, a tall woman with graying hair and a calm demeanor, stepped out. "Mr. and Mrs. Dorson, Alyssa," Principal Harris greeted them with a warm smile. "Please, come in." They followed her into the office, and Alyssa felt a surge of anxiety as the door closed behind them. She had never been in trouble before, had never had to sit in the principal's office like this. The room felt small and intimidating, despite Principal Harris's kind expression. "What can I do for you today?" Principal Harris asked, sitting down behind her desk and folding her hands in front of her. Daniel wasted no time getting to the point. "Our daughter has been mistreated by one of your teachers, Mr. Grayson, for weeks now. He's been singling her out, humiliating her in front of the class, making racist comments, and creating a hostile environment for her. This needs to stop." Principal Harris's smile faded, and she leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowed. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Dorson. I'm going to need more details about what has been happening." Alyssa glanced at her parents, then took a deep breath. It was time to tell the whole story. As Alyssa recounted everything, the cruel comments, the isolation, the way Mr. Grayson made her feel small and worthless, she watched the expression on Principal Harris's face grow darker. By the time she finished, the principal looked both horrified and furious. "I had no idea this was happening," Principal Harris said quietly, her voice tight with anger. "Alyssa, I am so sorry you've had to endure this. I can assure you we take matters like this very seriously. I will be conducting a full investigation into Mr. Grayson's behavior, and he will be held accountable for his actions." Daniel nodded, his face stern. "We expect nothing less." Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest. Part of her still couldn't believe that this was happening, that her voice was finally being heard, but there was also a lingering fear in the back of her mind. What if Mr. Grayson denied everything? What if nothing changed? As they left the office, Principal Harris promised to keep them updated on the investigation. Alyssa walked through the hallways with her parents, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. The weight of silence had been lifted, but the battle was far from over. She knew that confronting Mr. Grayson wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks she felt like she wasn't fighting this war alone. The confrontation with Mr. Grayson was inevitable. The investigation was just the beginning. But now, with her parents by her side and the principal's promise to take action, Alyssa could finally begin to see a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be challenging, but she had taken the first, most difficult step, breaking the silence. The days following the meeting with Principal Harris felt like a blur for Alyssa. She had told the truth, and her parents had taken action. But now, all she could do was wait. The investigation into Mr. Grayson's behavior had begun, and though she had been relieved to share her burden, there was still a gnawing fear inside her. What if nothing changed? What if Mr. Grayson stayed, and everything went back to how it was? But Alyssa wouldn't have to wait long. A week after the meeting, her parents sat her down at the kitchen table. Their faces were calm, but Alyssa could see the tension in their eyes. Daniel cleared his throat and took a deep breath before speaking. "Principal Harris called," he began. "They've concluded the investigation." Alyssa's heart raced as she leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "What did they say?" Mary reached out and took Alyssa's hand, her grip warm and reassuring. "Mr. Grayson has been removed from his position," she said softly. "They found that his behavior was unacceptable, and he won't be teaching at the school anymore." Alyssa's breath caught in her throat. "He's gone?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. "He's gone. And not only that, the school is introducing new policies to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. They're bringing in diversity training for the staff, and administration has taken this very seriously." Relief washed over Alyssa like a wave. It was over. The man who had tormented her, who had made her feel small and insignificant, was gone. She wouldn't have to see him again, wouldn't have to hear his condescending voice or feel the weight of his stares in the classroom. The knot in her stomach that had been there for so long began to loosen. But there was still so much to process. Even though Mr. Grayson was gone, the pain of what she had gone through still lingered. The isolation, the humiliation, those memories didn't just disappear overnight. "I'm proud of you," Mary said, squeezing her hand. "You were so brave, Alyssa. You spoke up when it mattered, and because of that, you made a difference." Alyssa felt a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. It wasn't easy to accept what had happened, but hearing her parents' words helped. She had been brave. She had faced something awful, and instead of letting it break her, she had found the strength to stand up against it. The next day, walking into school felt different. The weight that had hung over her for so long had lifted. Mr. Grayson wasn't there. His empty desk served as a reminder of what had happened, but it also represented a new beginning. The whispers and stares from her classmates had faded, and some even came up to her apologizing for not speaking out sooner. "Alyssa," one girl said quietly at lunch, "I'm sorry we didn't help. We should have done something." Alyssa didn't know what to say at first. It hurt that no one had stood by her when she needed them, but she also understood how fear could make people stay silent. "It's okay," Alyssa finally said, her voice soft but steady. "I just hope if this ever happens again, you'll stand up for what's right." The girl nodded, looking down at her tray. "We will. I promise." The days turned into weeks, and slowly Alyssa began to heal. Her parents made sure she had the support she needed, from counseling to just being there to listen when she needed to talk. At school, things were changing too. The new teacher, Mrs. Carter, was kind and understanding, making sure every student felt included and respected. The classroom no longer felt like a battlefield, but a place where Alyssa could finally learn and grow again. There were still difficult days. The memories of what she had endured didn't just vanish, but they no longer held the same power over her. With time, Alyssa's confidence returned. She threw herself back into her studies, participating in class discussions and even making new friends. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table with her math homework, Alyssa looked up at her parents and smiled. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Daniel and Mary exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with pride. "We're just glad you're okay, sweetheart," Mary said. "We'll always be here for you, no matter what." Alyssa nodded, feeling a warmth inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew there would always be challenges in life, but after everything she had been through, she also knew she could face them. She had a voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it anymore. And that, Alyssa thought, was the most important lesson she'd ever learned. Thank you for watching this emotional story. If it touched you, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our new videos. And don't forget to check out our other stories for more powerful and inspiring content. Let us know in the comments what part of the story resonated with you the most and share your thoughts. See you in the next video.